There is a particular kind of silence that happens in a saloon when something is about to go wrong. It doesn't arrive all at once. It starts in the corner nearest to the trouble and spreads outward like a cold draft, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the whole room is holding its breath, and the only people still making noise are the ones causing the problem. The stranger had heard this silence before. He was hearing it now. And the whiskey running down his face and dripping off the brim of his hat onto the bar counter was the reason it had started. The town was called Denton, small. 40 buildings if you counted the ones that were barely standing. A main street that ran east to west and ended in dust in both directions. The kind of town that existed because someone had put a well here 60 years ago, and everything else had grown around it the way towns grow around water, reluctantly and without much planning. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a feedlot, a church that held services every other Sunday because the preacher rode a circuit that included 4 other towns, and the Buckhorn Saloon, which was open every night because drinking didn't require a circuit. He'd arrived 3 hours earlier, not for the town, for the man who ran it. A rancher named Virgil Haynes had sent word through the channels that certain kinds of requests travel. Short message, simple problem. A gang had moved into Denton 6 months ago. Their leader was a man named Cullen Drake. Drake had taken the Buckhorn first, then the feedlot, then the blacksmith's contract. He didn't own them on paper. He owned them the way men like him always own things, by making the alternative to cooperation worse than cooperation itself. Haynes had a cattle operation 10 miles south. Drake wanted a cut of every sale. Haynes had said no. Haynes had a daughter who rode to town alone every week for supplies. Drake had mentioned this fact casually to Haynes in a conversation that wasn't casual at all. That was when Haynes sent the message. The stranger had read it, folded it, put it in his coat. Then he'd ridden for 3 days. Scout had been easy on the road, the horse reading the terrain the way he always did, ears forward, nostrils testing the air, the particular alertness that came from years of arriving in places where alertness was the difference between leaving and not leaving. They'd come into Denton from the east at mid-afternoon, and he'd felt the town's sickness within the first 2 minutes. It was in the way the blacksmith looked up from his anvil and then looked down again too quickly. It was in the way a woman crossed the street with her child pulled close against her hip, moving faster than the heat justified. It was in the way the general store had its door propped open, but the man behind the counter was standing too far back, positioned where he could see the street without being easily seen from it. He'd stabled Scout at the feedlot and walked to the Buckhorn because the Buckhorn was where Drake's men would be, and because the fastest way to understand a sickness is to sit in the middle of it and listen. The saloon was half full for mid-afternoon. 8 men at tables, 2 at the bar, a barkeep who moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned which topics were safe and which would get the glass knocked out of his hand. 3 of the 8 men at tables were Drake's. He knew this the way he always knew. They sat differently, not relaxed and not tense, positioned, chairs angled toward the door, drinks in the left hand, right hand free. The choreography of men who were working, not drinking. He'd ordered whiskey and stood at the bar and listened. An hour of listening told him what he needed. Cullen Drake was not in the saloon. Drake spent his afternoons at the house he'd taken on the north end of town, a house that had belonged to a widow named Phelps, who had left Denton 4 months ago, carrying 1 bag and an expression that the neighbors still talked about in low voices. Drake came to the Buckhorn at night, always after 8, always with at least 2 men, sometimes 4. The 3 in the saloon now were the daytime rotation, eyes and ears. They reported what they saw, and who they saw, and when a stranger rode in on a road horse and ordered whiskey at the bar, they saw that too. He was on his 2nd whiskey when the first one came over. Tall, lean, early 30s, the build of a man who had been in enough fights to know how to carry himself, and not enough to know when to stop. Dark hair under a flat-brimmed hat, 2 guns, the walk of someone who wanted the room to watch him walk. This was Mercer, Drake's lieutenant, the one who handled the daily operations of making a town afraid. Mercer leaned on the bar next to the stranger and didn't order a drink. He just stood there, close enough to be a statement. "Don't recognize you," Mercer said. "Just passing through," the stranger said. He didn't look at Mercer. He looked at his whiskey. Mercer studied him. The poncho, the hat, the way he held the glass. Reading him the way men in his profession read other men, looking for the tells that separate dangerous from harmless. The problem with reading the stranger was that the tells weren't there, not hidden, absent. The man at the bar registered as nothing, a blank space in a poncho. This confused Mercer. Confused was not an emotion Mercer handled well. "Passing through to where?" Mercer asked. "North," the stranger said. Mercer nodded slowly. The nod of a man performing thoughtfulness. "Well, you passed through. Have your drink. Move along." The stranger took a sip of whiskey, said nothing. The silence was the answer, and the answer was not the one Mercer wanted. The two other Drake men had turned in their chairs. The room had begun its migration toward quiet. The barkeep had moved to the far end of the counter with the instinct of a man who knew exactly how far a fistfight could reach. Mercer straightened up. He looked at the two men at the tables. Something passed between the three of them that didn't require words. One of them stood, stocky, red-faced, wide hands, the body of a man who had done manual labor before he'd found easier money. His name was Polk. He walked to the bar carrying a full bottle of whiskey, not his own. He'd taken it from a table where two townsmen were drinking. They hadn't protested. They'd watched the bottle leave the way people in Denton watched everything leave. Polk stood on the other side of the stranger, Mercer on the left, Polk on the right. The geometry of intimidation that he'd seen in 100 saloons in 100 towns. What happened next was not spontaneous. It was rehearsed. The kind of thing Drake's men did to people who didn't move along when told to move along. A demonstration. A message delivered in whiskey and humiliation that the whole room could read. Polk raised the bottle above the stranger's head and poured. The whiskey hit his hat first, running over the brim in streams, soaking the crown, flowing down onto his shoulders, through the poncho to the shirt underneath, cold and sharp with the smell of cheap grain alcohol. The room went silent in the way he'd been thinking about, the silence that starts close and spreads until it fills everything. Polk emptied the entire bottle. It took about 8 seconds. 8 seconds of whiskey pouring over a man who did not move. Mercer laughed. Polk laughed. The third man at the table laughed. The sound was loud in the quiet room, bouncing off the walls and the bar and the faces of every person in the Buckhorn who was watching and not laughing. The barkeep had his eyes closed. Two men near the door were halfway out of their chairs, calculating whether they could leave without being noticed. The stranger stood absolutely still. Whiskey dripped from his hat brim, from his chin, from the tips of his fingers. It pooled on the bar counter and ran off the edge onto the floor. He looked straight ahead at the bottles behind the bar and at his own reflection in the mirror, wet and still and patient. Mercer leaned in close. He could smell the whiskey on the stranger's skin. "Now finish your drink and get out," Mercer said. The grin was still there, wide. The grin of a man who had done this before, and who believed that what followed was always the same. The stranger leaving, the room remembering, the lesson taught. The stranger reached up slowly. He took the hat off. He tipped the whiskey off the brim. He put the hat back on. Then he turned his head and looked at Mercer, not quickly, not with anger, with the flat, settled gaze of a man who had just made a decision and was now living inside it. "You owe me a whiskey," the stranger said. Mercer's grin faltered. Not a lot. A flicker. The flicker of a man who had expected a script and was hearing a different line. The stranger turned to Polk. Same gaze. Polk stopped laughing. The third man at the table had already stopped. The room was aware, in the way that rooms become aware when the physics of a situation shift, that something had changed. The stranger was not leaving. The stranger was not angry. The stranger was not doing any of the things that men do when they've been humiliated in public. He was standing in a puddle of whiskey looking at three men with an expression that contained nothing they could use. He picked up his glass. The whiskey inside was still his. He drank it, set it down, turned to the barkeep. "Another," he said. The barkeep poured with shaking hands. The stranger drank the third whiskey, standing in the same spot, dripping, unhurried, as if the three men next to him were furniture he'd chosen not to rearrange yet. Then he walked out. Not fast, not slow. Through the doors and into the afternoon light and down the steps and into the street. The saloon exhaled behind him. Mercer looked at Polk. Polk looked at Mercer. The grin tried to come back. It didn't fit the same way. He went to the feedlot, changed his shirt, wrung out the poncho and hung it over Scout's stall. The horse looked at him with the particular expression that Scout reserved for situations where things had been done to his rider that the horse did not approve of. He rubbed Scout's neck and said nothing. Then he went to work. Virgil Haynes was waiting at the edge of town in a buckboard. The stranger had sent word through the livery boy to meet him here. Haynes was 60, thick through the chest, hands like shovels, the face of a man who had been angry for 6 months and had converted the anger into something he could use. He looked at the stranger's wet hair and didn't ask. They drove to Haynes's ranch. The stranger talked, and Haynes listened. He needed 3 things from Haynes: the original property records for the widow Phelps's house, the name of the territorial judge who covered this district, an account of how many men in Denton would stand if someone gave them a reason to stand. Haynes had the records. He'd been keeping them since Phelps left because someone had to, and the county clerk in Denton had stopped keeping things that might embarrass Drake. The judge's name was Alder. 3 days' ride in Brennan. And the men who would stand? Haynes thought about it. The blacksmith. The barkeep, if he believed it was safe. Tom Kinney, who ran the general store, maybe 4 or 5 others. They're not cowards, Haynes said. They're calculating. They'll move when the calculation changes. Then I need to change the calculation, the stranger said. He rode back to Denton after dark, not to the Buckhorn, to the house on the north end of town where Cullen Drake was holding court. He didn't go inside. He sat on the roof of the building across the street, a boarding house with a flat roof and an easy climb, and he watched. Drake's operation ran on schedule. Men came and went at predictable intervals. Drake himself was visible through the front window. 45 years old, medium build, dark beard, the posture of a man who sat in chairs like he owned them, which, in Denton, he did. He counted. Drake had 7 men total, including Mercer and Polk. 3 at the house, 3 rotating through town. Mercer moved between both. 7 was manageable. 7 was arithmetic. He didn't sleep that night. He spent it at the telegraph office. The operator was a young man named Finch, who was terrified and cooperative, in the way that terrified people become cooperative when someone offers them an alternative to being terrified. The stranger sent 4 telegrams, 1 to Judge Alder, 1 to the Federal Land Office, 1 to the Territorial Marshal's office, and 1 to an address that Finch didn't recognize and that the stranger didn't explain. The messages were short, precise, each one a piece of a structure he was building in the dark while Drake slept in a stolen house. By morning, he had the replies. Alder would issue a writ. The Land Office had flagged Drake's acquisitions. The Territorial Marshal was sending a deputy. And the 4th reply simply said, received. He went to the blacksmith first. A man named Garrett, no relation to any Garrett in any other town. A man who shoed horses and repaired wagon axles, and who had watched Drake's men walk past his shop every day for 6 months with the expression of a hammer that wanted to swing and couldn't find the right nail. The stranger told him what was coming. Garrett listened. Then Garrett went to his back room and came out with a shotgun that had been oiled and loaded and waiting. Tom Kinney at the general store was next. Then the barkeep, whose name was Sullivan, and whose courage had been hiding behind his caution this entire time, waiting for someone to tell him the caution wasn't necessary anymore. By noon, the stranger had 7 men, not fighters, shopkeepers, ranchers, working men, but 7 men who had been living under something for 6 months and who had just been told the something was ending. He went to the Buckhorn at 2 in the afternoon. Same bar, same stool. The poncho was dry now. The hat was dry. He ordered whiskey and stood there drinking it and waiting for the machine to notice him. Mercer noticed. Mercer walked over with the expression of a man who couldn't believe what he was seeing. The same stranger, the same bar, the same stool. The audacity of it cracked something in Mercer's understanding of how the world worked, because in Mercer's world, men who got whiskey poured on their heads did not come back to the same bar the next day and order more. You're either stupid or crazy, Mercer said. Neither, the stranger said. He reached into his coat. Mercer's hand went to his gun. The stranger pulled out paper. He placed it on the bar. A territorial writ signed by Judge Alder declaring the transfer of the Phelps property null and void. A federal flag on every property Drake had acquired in Denton, and a letter from the Territorial Marshal's office confirming that a deputy was en route. Mercer read it. He read it again. The words didn't change the second time. He looked at the stranger with the expression of a man standing on ground that had just shifted beneath him. Drake needs to see this, Mercer said. Drake is going to see it, the stranger said. At 5 o'clock, in this saloon, in front of the town. Mercer looked at the documents, looked at the stranger, looked at the room, which was watching with the particular attention of people who have been waiting for something without knowing what it was, and are now seeing it arrive. Mercer left. At 5 o'clock, the Buckhorn was full. Not because anyone had been invited, because Denton was a small town and word moved through it the way water moves through cracks, finding every gap, filling every space. The stranger stood at the bar. Haynes stood near the door. Garrett, the blacksmith, stood by the window with the shotgun he wasn't hiding anymore. Sullivan, the barkeep, stood behind his own bar for the first time in 6 months like a man who owned it. Drake walked in with 4 men, Mercer, Polk, and 2 others. The remaining 3 were outside. Drake looked around the room. He saw the faces. He saw Garrett with the shotgun. He saw Haynes by the door. He saw the stranger at the bar, dry this time, standing in the same spot where his men had poured a bottle of whiskey over his head 24 hours ago. Drake was smart enough to read a room. The room had changed. The stranger laid out the documents on the bar the way a card player lays down a winning hand. Calm, ordered. Each piece placed where Drake could see it. The writ, the federal flag, the marshal's letter, And one more document that hadn't existed yesterday morning. A signed statement from the county clerk recanting every filing he'd made on Drake's behalf, witnessed by Tom Kinney and two other men whose names the clerk had written in handwriting that shook, but held. Drake looked at the paper. He looked at the room. He was calculating. Men like Drake always calculate. The numbers, the odds, the angles, the exits. But the calculation kept coming up the same way. The paper was real. The marshal was coming. The town was standing. And the man at the bar who had let whiskey be poured over his head without blinking was the reason all of it was happening. "Why didn't you fight yesterday?" Drake asked. "Because yesterday wasn't ready," the stranger said. Drake stared at him. The stare of a man who was beginning to understand that the humiliation in the saloon, the whiskey, the laughter, all of it had been absorbed deliberately, taken in and filed, and used as fuel for something the stranger was already building, while Drake's men were still grinning about a wet poncho. "You let them pour a drink on your head so you could do this," Drake said. The stranger didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. Drake turned to Mercer. Mercer's face had the quality of a man who had just realized that the thing he'd laughed at yesterday was the thing that was ending him today. The connection between the whiskey and the documents on the bar was a line that ran straight through his own grinning face. And he could see it now, and everyone in the room could see him seeing it. Polk left first. He walked out without a word. One of the two unnamed men followed, then the other. Mercer stood for a long time. He looked at Drake. Drake didn't look back. When the man you work for stops looking at you, the employment is over. Mercer left. Drake stood alone in a full saloon. The room watched him. Every person who had crossed the street too fast, every person who had spoken too quietly, every person who had watched bottles leave their tables without protest was watching now. The weight of their watching was heavier than anything his men had ever done to them. The stranger said nothing. He didn't need to. The room was saying it. Drake picked up his hat from the bar. He walked to the door. Haynes stepped aside to let him pass. Not out of respect, out of the understanding that a man walking toward the end of something should be allowed to walk there on his own. Drake rode out of Denton that night. By morning, his house was empty. The widow Phelps's furniture was still inside, dusty and rearranged, but present. Sullivan found a half-eaten meal on the kitchen table. Drake had left in the middle of supper. The particular exit of a man who had finally run out of room. The deputy marshal arrived 2 days later. There was nothing left for him to do except file the paperwork and drink Sullivan's whiskey, and listen to the story that the entire town wanted to tell him, each person adding their piece, each piece fitting into a picture that none of them could have built alone, but that all of them had lived inside. The stranger was gone by then. He'd left the morning after Drake, before dawn, the way he always left. Sullivan had tried to give him a bottle, the good stuff, the stuff he kept behind the false panel that Drake's men had never found. The stranger had taken it. That was unusual. He didn't usually take things. He thought about it riding north, about Mercer leaning in close with whiskey on his breath saying, "Now finish your drink and get out," about the 8 seconds it took for a bottle to empty onto a man's head, about the silence of a room watching something happen that it couldn't stop, and about the same room, 24 hours later, standing. Every face in it changed, not because the danger was gone, because they had discovered, together, in the same room where they'd been afraid, that the danger was smaller than they'd believed. It always was. Scout moved at the easy trot. The road opened north. Somewhere ahead, because there was always somewhere ahead, the next town was waiting. The next man who believed that owning people was the same as owning land. The next room that needed to learn that the silence of fear and the silence of patience look exactly the same from the outside, and that confusing the two is a mistake that only gets made once. If this is where you found him, if Denton is your first ride, the beginning is waiting. Both stories in the description. Watch them. Come back. Tell me one thing in the comments. Which moment stayed with you? 2 words. That's all. And if you want to know where the trail goes next, subscribe. New stories every week. I'll see you on the road.